You think that old man's just sweeping the floor? Wait till you hear who he really is." The words echoed through the gym as Mike, Titan, Walker silently moved across the polished floor, his mop barely making a sound. The SEALs in the training room barely noticed him. He was just another janitor, gray hair, worn-out sneakers, and an old jacket. The kind of man you'd ignore if you were too busy, too important. "Hey, Grandpa, can you clean up over there?" One of the younger SEALs, Private Harris, called out with a smirk. "This place is a mess. What are you going to do? Sweep the enemies away?" The other men chuckled, glancing at the aging veteran with disdain. Mike didn't flinch. He'd been through worse. Years of combat, bloodshed, and moments where the world seemed to stop, but not today. Today, he was just a janitor. His hands moved methodically, wiping the floor with precision, but the eyes of the room never saw beyond his age. The door to the gym opened and Commander Davis, the man in charge of the SEAL team, walked in. His sharp uniform and clean-cut appearance screamed authority. He nodded curtly to the men as he walked to his office, not giving a second glance to Mike. But something caught his eye. The tattoo on Mike's neck. A simple design, but it was no ordinary ink. It was the mark of a legend, a symbol of a battle fought long ago, when Mike had saved an entire unit from the jaws of death. Commander Davis had seen that tattoo before, but not on anyone who looked like Mike. He stopped in his tracks, his eyes narrowing as he took in the faded ink. The other SEALs were too busy to notice the change in the commander's demeanor. He stepped forward, his curiosity getting the better of him. "Mike," he called, his voice stern yet intrigued. "Where did you get that tattoo?" Mike paused, looking up for the first time since he'd entered. His eyes, pale blue and steady, locked onto the commander's. There was no fear in them, only a quiet, undeniable strength. He didn't answer right away. His hand rested briefly on the mop handle, as if deciding how much to reveal. Finally, his voice broke the silence, low and raspy. "I got it in Vietnam. A long time ago, back when the world was different." Commander Davis took a step closer, a frown forming on his face. "Vietnam? You've got to be kidding. You're just a janitor now. What makes you think?" Before he could finish, the rest of the room fell silent. The SEALs, sensing the shift in the air, stopped talking. They didn't know what was happening, but they felt the change. Davis looked over at the other men, who were now watching the exchange closely. He turned back to Mike. "What's your real story, Titan?" Mike's lips twitched into a small smile. "The story? I don't talk about it much. But you're right about one thing. I'm not just a janitor. I was a SEAL. And that tattoo, it's a reminder of what we went through." The room was still, the air thick with the weight of his words. The tension built as the men stared, their previous mockery now replaced by something else. Respect, awe, maybe even fear. Mike took a slow breath, his gaze returning to the floor as he resumed his task. But this time, the sound of the mop hitting the floor seemed different. It wasn't just the scrape of wood on dirt. It was the sound of a man, once a hero, now forgotten, being seen for the first time. And in that moment, Commander Davis knew, Mike wasn't just any old man. He was a legend. And he wasn't here by accident. The gym was quiet now, the usual chatter replaced by the low hum of the ceiling fans. Mike's mop glided across the floor as the SEALs watched him, their eyes no longer filled with mockery, but curiosity. Commander Davis stood nearby, his hands folded behind his back, still processing the words Mike had spoken. He had seen that tattoo before, but never on someone like Mike. "Titan," Davis muttered to himself, the name like a ghost of the past. "Why didn't you tell us?" The words seemed to hang in the air, and for the first time, Mike looked up at him, his eyes cold and steady. "Because it doesn't matter," Mike said, his voice low but clear. "The past is just that, the past. But if you want to know, I'll tell you." The gym felt smaller as the tension in the room thickened. The other SEALs exchanged glances, unsure of whether they should stay or leave. "It was in Vietnam," Mike continued, his hands steady on the mop. "We were deep in the jungle, cut off from the rest of the unit. It was supposed to be a quick in-and-out mission, but things went sideways fast. We had one objective, to get the intel back. But the enemy was all around us. We lost a lot of good men that day." Mike's gaze drifted toward the wall, but his thoughts were far away, back in that dense jungle where the air had been thick with smoke and the ground soaked with blood. "I did what I had to do. I carried men out of there. And when we were cornered, I made sure they got to safety. That tattoo is a reminder of that day. The day I saved my team. A quiet gasp rippled through the room. The men had been laughing at him just moments ago, but now they were listening, hanging on every word. And when I came back, Mike said, his voice a little thicker, I didn't need anyone's approval. I didn't need medals or recognition. I did what I had to do. Commander Davis, still standing there, now felt a deep respect for the man in front of him. He had heard rumors about the mysterious veteran, but hearing it from Mike himself was something different. We didn't know, Davis said quietly. We never asked. Mike finally stopped mopping, his eyes meeting Davis's with the weight of years behind them. No one ever does, Mike replied. They just assume. But there's more to a man than what he does now. What matters is what he's done, and what he's willing to do. The gym was still. The air had shifted. No one was laughing now. The SEALs, who had once mocked Mike, now stood with a new understanding in their eyes. The commander nodded, his posture no longer one of authority, but one of respect. I'm sorry, Mike, he said. You deserve better than this. Mike gave a small, knowing smile. Doesn't matter, he said, picking up the mop again. This is where I'm supposed to be. Just here, doing my part. As the room watched him, they realized something. They were in the presence of a legend, not because of his past, but because of the man he was now. And for the first time in a long while, they treated him as such. The next day, the gym was quieter than usual. The usual hum of machines, the sound of weights hitting the floor, and the sharp commands of the trainers were absent. Today, the atmosphere felt different, more respectful, almost reverent. The SEALs who had mocked Mike the day before now moved with a new sense of purpose, and even the younger recruits seemed to glance at him with a touch of admiration. Commander Davis walked in, this time without his usual brisk, commanding stride. He approached Mike, who was once again doing his job, pushing the mop back and forth with practiced ease. Mike, Davis said, his voice softer than before. We're about to start a new training session. I know we've had our differences in the past, but I want to ask you something. Mike didn't look up immediately, but he nodded slightly. What's on your mind, Commander? He asked, his voice still steady and calm, as if the events of yesterday had never happened. I want you to be part of the training today, Davis continued, taking a step closer. We're about to conduct an operation simulation, and I need someone who's been there, someone who knows what it's really like in the field. I've heard stories about you, but I want to see it for myself. Mike paused, his hands stilling on the mop. He looked up at Davis, his expression unreadable for a moment. You think I'm ready to jump back into all that? He asked. I'm just a janitor now. Davis smiled, but it wasn't a mocking smile. It was genuine. You're more than that, Mike. I see it now. Mike didn't respond right away. He stood there for a few seconds, the room silent except for the faint sound of his boots on the floor. Then, with a deep breath, he spoke. All right, Commander. I'll help, but don't expect me to play nice. With that, he set the mop aside and walked toward the door. Davis followed, his heart racing slightly at the thought of having the legendary Mike Walker back in action, even if only for a brief simulation. As they walked down the hall, Mike's pace was steady, his posture relaxed, but there was an energy about him that Davis hadn't seen before. They entered the simulation area, where the SEAL team had already assembled. The room quieted as soon as Mike stepped in, and the tension in. The air was palpable. The recruits exchanged uncertain glances, unsure of what to make of the quiet veteran who had once been a legend. Mike's eyes scanned the room, taking in the familiar faces of the men he had worked with years ago. All right, let's do this, Mike said, his voice clear and commanding now, no longer the humble janitor, but the man who had once led teams through the toughest battles. The simulation began, and Mike seamlessly fell into the rhythm of the exercise. His movements were precise, his strategies sharp, and his calmness in the face of chaos was something the young recruits couldn't ignore. As the simulation progressed, Davis watched in awe as Mike orchestrated the movements of the team with the ease of someone who had been there, who had seen it all. The recruits were struggling to keep up, but Mike wasn't pushing them too hard. He was teaching them without words, showing them how to think, how to move, how to survive. By the end of the session, the recruits were exhausted but had learned more in those few hours than they had in months of training. Davis stood in the back, still processing the fact that Mike had once been this man, this leader, this legend. After the exercise ended, Davis walked over to Mike, his admiration clear. I knew you were good, Davis said, but I had no idea how good. You didn't just train them, you showed them what it means to be a SEAL. Mike nodded, his face expressionless, but his eyes betrayed a flicker of pride. I didn't do it for recognition, he said quietly. I did it because it's what we do. We pass it on. We make sure they're ready. And when it's their turn, they'll pass it on too. The gym was quieter as Mike walked away, leaving behind a room full of SEALs who would never forget the lesson he taught them. They had learned from a legend, not because he had to teach them, but because he knew it was his duty to pass on the knowledge and the respect that had been earned through years of service. And for the first time in a long time, Mike didn't feel like a janitor anymore. The days following the simulation were different. The gym, once filled with the sound of laughter and mockery, was now a place of respect and focus. The younger recruits no longer looked at Mike as just the janitor. They watched him as he moved through the room, his every action deliberate, every step measured. Commander Davis had kept his promise. He didn't just let Mike walk out of that gym without a word. He made sure everyone knew what Mike had done for them. Word spread quickly through the base. Mike, Titan, Walker wasn't just some retired soldier. He was a living legend, a man whose actions spoke louder than any medal or rank ever could. The men who had mocked him, the ones who had thought he was nothing more than an old man mopping floors, began to approach him. They asked questions. They wanted to know more. Mike never turned them away, but he didn't say much either. He simply shared his experiences when it was needed, never boasting, just speaking the truth. One afternoon, as Mike was finishing his shift, Lieutenant Colonel Harris walked into the gym. He was a man of few words, but the look in his eyes told Mike everything. "Mike, I need to talk to you," Harris said, his voice low. Mike nodded and set down his cleaning supplies. He followed Harris to a quieter part of the base, where they wouldn't be disturbed. "I've been hearing things," Harris started, his eyes serious. "The men are looking at you differently now, and I need to know something." Mike raised an eyebrow. "What's that, Colonel?" "I need to know if you're willing to come back. Just for a few missions. You've got skills no one else here has. The SEALs need men like you." Mike stood still, the weight of the question hanging in the air. He had been out of the game for a long time. The thought of stepping back into the field, even for a brief moment, felt strange. But then, the memories hit him. The camaraderie, the purpose, the times he had saved lives, the victories and the losses. "I'm not what I used to be," Mike said quietly. "I'm just an old man now." Harris looked at him for a long moment. "You've always been more than that. And the men need you. I need you. But I won't ask you to make a decision now. Just think about it." Mike nodded, but in his mind, he was already thinking. He knew what his answer would be. The next few days were filled with a strange sense of anticipation. Mike went about his duties, but his mind was elsewhere. The pull to return to the life he had left behind was strong, and despite his age, despite the years that had passed, a part of him still longed for the action, the challenge. But he also knew the price. He had seen what it did to men. He had seen their spirits break, their bodies give out, and their lives consumed by the battles they fought. But what did it mean to be a SEAL if not to keep fighting, even when the odds were stacked against you? When the day came for Mike to give his answer, he didn't hesitate. He went to Colonel Harris and said, "I'm in, but only if I do it my way." Harris's face broke into a grin. "That's the Mike I remember." And so, Mike, Titan Walker returned. Not as a man chasing glory, not as someone seeking redemption, but as a veteran who had seen it all and knew what it meant to truly serve. He didn't need the spotlight, didn't need to prove himself. He just needed to make sure the job got done, that the mission was a success. And with that, the legend of Mike Walker, the quiet janitor who had once saved an entire SEAL team, would continue to grow, one mission at a time. The first mission back was different. The base buzzed with anticipation as Mike stood at the edge of the briefing room, his eyes scanning the room. The young SEALs, fresh-faced and eager, were getting ready for their first real test. Mike had seen this look before, the hunger for action, the belief that they were invincible. But he knew better. The mission was simple in theory. A standard reconnaissance operation, scouting a remote area suspected of harboring enemy forces. But Mike had been around long enough to know that things rarely went according to plan. As the briefing unfolded, Mike remained silent, listening, watching the other men make their notes, ask questions, strategize. His mind was elsewhere, already running through contingencies. His experience wasn't just based on past victories, It was based on surviving the unexpected, the moments when everything fell apart. Once the briefing ended, the team geared up, the usual flurry of motion, the clicking of helmets and equipment, the tightening of straps. Mike moved slower than he used to, but every action was deliberate. The others had no idea how many times he had done this, how many times he had suited up for a mission that would take him to places he never wanted to go. The hum of helicopters filled the air as the team boarded the transport, each man taking his place. Mike took a seat by the window, his hands resting on his knees. The younger SEALs were talking excitedly, reviewing their plans and what they expected to encounter. But Mike's gaze was focused on the horizon, his mind already processing the mission, the terrain, the risks. As the helicopter soared higher, he felt a strange calm settle over him. The noise of the rotors, the chatter of the team, all faded into the background. He had been in enough combat situations to know that, in the end, it wasn't the planning or the tactics that mattered most. It was how you handled the chaos when it inevitably arrived. Hours later, they were dropped into the dense woods. The team moved swiftly, their steps light and careful. Mike led from the back, his eyes scanning every corner of the landscape, every shadow. He could hear the younger men ahead, their energy a stark contrast to his calm. It wasn't long before they hit their first obstacle, an unexpected ambush. The enemy had been waiting. Shots rang out, sharp and quick, breaking the silence of the woods. The younger SEALs reacted, moving into formation, returning fire. Mike stayed behind, watching. He wasn't worried about the firefight itself, it was part of the job. But what mattered was the response. Who would hold steady under pressure? Who would panic? His instincts kicked in as he moved forward, signaling the team to flank the enemy position. His movements were fluid, precise. He didn't need to yell orders or make dramatic moves. His presence alone was enough. The younger SEALs watched as he moved, his confidence contagious. It was the quiet ones who knew the most, and they began to understand that. As the mission came to an end, the team gathered back together, surveying the area. They had completed the objective, an easy win, but the real lesson was in how they handled the chaos. Mike's face remained impassive, but inside, he was proud. Not because of the success, but because the team had learned something. They had learned to trust their instincts, to stay focused, to move without hesitation. As they made their way back to base, the younger SEALs were different. They no longer saw Mike as just the janitor, the old man with the faded tattoo. They saw him for what he was, a living legend, a man who had earned his place not through words, but through action. The mission had been a success, but more importantly, the men had gained something they hadn't expected, respect. And for Mike, that was all that mattered. The weeks passed by, and with each mission, Mike's presence on the team became more and more valued. His calm under pressure, his ability to make quick decisions, and his quiet wisdom were lessons that the young SEALs began to appreciate. They no longer saw him as the janitor or the old man with the faded tattoo. They saw him as a mentor, someone who had been through the fire and come out stronger, someone who could teach them what it meant to be truly unstoppable. But Mike knew the truth. This was all temporary. He wasn't going to be on every mission, and he certainly wasn't going to stay for long. He had already lived through his fair share of wars, both in battle and in his personal life. He had nothing left to prove. Yet, every time he saw the young recruits looking to him for guidance, it brought something inside of him to life. It reminded him of the brotherhood, the trust, and the sense of purpose that had once been his entire world. One evening, after a long day of training, Mike found himself sitting alone on a bench outside the barracks. The sun had just set, casting long shadows across the base. He was tired, both physically and mentally. His body wasn't what it used to be, and neither was his mind. But there was something peaceful about this quiet moment. The sounds of the base were distant now, the noise of running engines and shouting officers fading into the background. It was just him and the evening sky. He sat there for what felt like hours, lost in thought, when he heard footsteps approaching. It was Lieutenant Colonel Harris, the same man who had asked him to return for the missions. Harris had been watching Mike's progress over the past few weeks, and he couldn't help but notice the changes in the men around him. The young recruits were learning more than just tactics. They were learning what it meant to truly be a SEAL, and that lesson was coming from a man who wasn't even officially on the team. "Mike," Harris said, taking a seat next to him, "you've been a huge help to these men. I've seen them change, seen them grow. Mike looked at him, his expression unreadable. It's not about me, he said simply. It's about them. They're the ones who need to be ready. I'm just here to make sure they don't forget what it means to stay calm when it matters most. Harris nodded, understanding more than Mike knew. I've been thinking, Harris said, about what you said before, about being just an old man now. But I don't think you realize just how much of a difference you're making. The team looks up to you. You might not wear the uniform, but you're still leading them, teaching them what it really means to be a part of this family. Mike looked out over the base, the distant lights flickering in the darkness. He didn't say anything for a long moment. Finally, he spoke, his voice low. I never wanted to be a leader. I just wanted to survive. But if I can make sure these guys don't make the same mistakes I did, then I guess I'll stay a little longer. Harris smiled, but it wasn't a smile of victory. It was a smile of understanding. That's all anyone can ask for. And with that, Mike's place on the team was no longer temporary. He wasn't just a veteran returning for one last mission. He was a mentor, a leader, and most importantly, a reminder to every SEAL in that room of what it meant to fight, to survive, and to lead with honor. The young men who once underestimated him now looked to him with respect, and for the first time in years, Mike realized that his true purpose wasn't just in the battles he fought, but in the legacy he would leave behind. As the weeks continued to pass, Mike found himself more entrenched with the team than ever before. The younger recruits had grown to respect him, and the bond between them had only deepened. His presence was no longer a mere reminder of the past. It had become an integral part of their training. They turned to him for guidance, not just in strategy, but in how to conduct themselves as SEALs, how to carry the weight of the title with humility and honor. One day, after a grueling training exercise, Mike sat alone in the locker room, his eyes fixed on the floor as the sound of the other men talking faded into the background. His body was sore, aches that he hadn't felt in years creeping up on him. It was moments like these that reminded him of how far he had come, and how much had changed. He had never planned on staying this long, never intended to get so involved. But the team had become his family. The thought of leaving now felt strange. His life had always been about surviving, about pushing through each day, each mission. But here, in this gym, with these young men, it felt different. The door to the locker room creaked open, and Mike didn't need to look up to know who it was. Lieutenant Colonel Harris stepped inside, his footsteps quiet but purposeful. Mike, Harris said, his voice calm and steady. Mike looked up slowly, meeting his gaze. You've been quiet lately, Harris continued. You feeling all right? Mike gave a slight nod, but his mind was elsewhere. I'm just getting older, Harris, he said, his voice raspy. That's all. Harris took a seat next to him, not saying anything for a moment. You've done more than enough for this team, Harris finally said. But I think they need more from you. They need to hear your story. They need to know who you are, what you've been through. Mike was quiet for a long time. The weight of the request hung in the air, and for the first time in a long while, he didn't know how to respond. I've told them enough, Mike said quietly. They know what they need to know. I don't need to tell them more. Harris sighed, looking at him with a knowing expression. Mike, they look up to you. Not just for what you've done here, but for what you've been through. They don't just need to learn from your skills. They need to learn from your experience. From your life. Mike stared straight ahead, the memories of his past rushing back. The days of combat, the faces of the men he had lost, the weight of every decision he had made. He had always kept it to himself, never wanting to burden anyone with his past. But maybe Harris was right. Maybe they needed to hear it. Maybe he needed to say it. After a long silence, Mike finally spoke. I wasn't always a hero. I wasn't always the man you see here. He paused, his voice growing softer. There was a time when I didn't know if I'd make it out alive. Every day was a fight to stay alive, to survive. But I did it. And I did it for my brothers, my team. I never did it for the medals, the recognition. I did it because it was the right thing to do. Harris listened intently, not interrupting. And I've been carrying that weight ever since, Mike continued. I've been carrying the faces of the men I couldn't save. The ones who didn't make it home. And that's the hardest part, living with that. But if I can help these guys, if I can make sure they don't have to carry that same weight, then maybe I can make peace with it all. Harris sat in silence for a moment, then placed a hand on Mike's shoulder. You've already done more than enough, he said quietly. But you're not alone anymore. We're all in this together. Mike nodded slowly, the weight of his words settling in. He wasn't sure what the future held, but for the first time in a long time, he felt like he could face it. He wasn't just a janitor anymore. He was a mentor, a leader, and maybe, just maybe, he was finally starting to understand the impact of the legacy he had left behind. As the days continued to pass, Mike found himself becoming more and more a part of the team. His role had shifted once again. He wasn't just the quiet veteran anymore, the man with the stories and wisdom from a life lived in the shadows. He had become an integral part of the group, a figure the young SEALs now looked to not only for guidance, but for reassurance. There was a quiet strength in his presence, one that spoke volumes without needing to say a word. The missions were still coming, and each one presented new challenges. Mike had grown accustomed to the weight of command, though he would never admit it aloud. He'd taken on the role of an unofficial leader, but it wasn't the kind of leadership that demanded attention. It was the kind that was earned by quiet actions, by decisions made in the heat of the moment, by the calm that followed the storm. One afternoon, during a rare break from training, Mike found himself walking the perimeter of the base, his thoughts wandering as the sounds of activity faded behind him. He wasn't used to stillness. It felt strange, almost uncomfortable. But there was something about this moment, something about the way the sun hung low in the sky, that made him reflect on everything that had led him here. It wasn't just the years of service, the battles fought and survived, the comrades lost. It was something more. It was the realization that the life he had led, the quiet existence he had built, had led him back here, to a place where he could give something back. A place where he could finally find peace with his past. He had spent so much of his life trying to outrun the ghosts of his past, the memories of the men he couldn't save, the choices that haunted him. But now, surrounded by these young men, these fresh faces eager to learn, Mike began to understand that maybe, just maybe, his purpose wasn't to run from those memories. Maybe it was to help create new ones for them, ones that would keep them safe, ones that would help them become the men they were meant to be. As he turned back toward the base, he spotted Lieutenant Colonel Harris walking toward him, his face serious but not unfriendly. Harris had been keeping an eye on Mike, watching him closely, and it hadn't gone unnoticed. "Mike," Harris called, stopping a few feet away. "I've been meaning to talk to you. The team is ready for the next big mission. But before we go forward, I want you to know something." Mike raised an eyebrow, his curiosity piqued. "What's that, Colonel?" "The team is relying on you," Harris said. "I've seen it, the way they look to you. You've become more than just a mentor to them. You've become their foundation. They're not just learning tactics, they're learning how to be men. And that's something I haven't seen in a long time." Mike didn't respond immediately. His mind was racing, but he kept his face calm. "I'm just doing what needs to be done," he finally said. Harris nodded. "I know, and I'm grateful for it. But I think it's time we all acknowledged what you've been doing for this team. You've taught them more than any drill sergeant could." For the first time in a long time, Mike felt a flicker of something inside him, a sense of purpose, a feeling of being seen. It wasn't about recognition. It wasn't about accolades. It was about the work, the quiet work of shaping the future. As they stood there, the sun slowly disappearing behind the horizon, Mike realized that he had found his place, not just as a veteran, not just as a mentor, but as a part of something bigger. He wasn't just a man trying to outrun his past anymore. He was building a future, one where the lessons of the past would live on, in the young men who would carry them forward. And that, he knew, was worth everything. The mission was set. This time, it wasn't just about completing the objective. It was about proving to the team that they were ready for anything. Mike had been on enough operations to know that success wasn't guaranteed, but it was in the preparation, in the way a team worked together, that the outcome was decided. As the men gathered in the briefing room, Mike stood at the back, his presence quiet but noticeable. The younger recruits had stopped looking at him like he was a relic of the past. They had learned to trust him, to follow his example, and that was something he had earned over time. The mission itself was critical. A high-value target had been identified, and the team had to infiltrate a compound deep in the wilderness to capture or eliminate the threat. The stakes were higher than ever, but Mike had seen worse. He had seen teams go in with high hopes and come out shattered. This wasn't just about tactics or weapons. It was about mental toughness, about knowing when to push forward and when to step back. As the briefing concluded, Lieutenant Colonel Harris looked around the room, his eyes falling on Mike. "You ready, Mike?" he asked. Mike met his gaze and nodded. "Let's get it done." The team moved quickly to gear up, the usual noise and energy filling the air. But Mike didn't rush. He took his time, checking his equipment methodically. He didn't need to be the first one ready, but he needed to be the one who was always prepared. The younger SEALs were all keyed up, but Mike's calmness was a steadying force. As they boarded the helicopter, Mike took a seat by the door, his eyes scanning the landscape below. The team was silent now, each of them focused, the weight of the mission hanging over them. The helicopter lifted off, the roar of the blades filling the air, but Mike was in his own world, his thoughts sharp and clear. He knew the terrain they were heading into. He knew the risks, but he also knew the importance of staying grounded, of not letting the chaos consume them. The ride was long, and the tension built with every passing minute. As the helicopter descended into the landing zone, Mike's eyes locked onto the horizon. He didn't speak, but his posture shifted, a slight change that signaled he was ready. The team moved quickly, assembling in their formation. They moved through the dense woods, their steps light but deliberate. Mike led from the rear, keeping an eye on the group, guiding them through the terrain. It wasn't long before they reached the compound. The team went into action, their movements coordinated, seamless. Mike stayed back, covering the perimeter, ensuring nothing was overlooked. The seconds stretched on, each one feeling like an eternity. The team moved in and engaged with precision. Mike didn't need to intervene, not yet. The operation was going smoothly, and the younger men were executing their training perfectly. But Mike was always prepared for the unexpected. And sure enough, it came. A sudden burst of gunfire rang out from a concealed position, a sniper taking aim at the team. Without hesitation, Mike moved into action, signaling to the team to take cover. He moved swiftly, silently, his experience guiding him through the chaos. The sniper was neutralized within moments, but it wasn't about the kill. It was about the decision-making, the way the team adapted and responded. As the compound was cleared, Mike stayed in the background, his face impassive as the team wrapped up the operation. It was a success. They had completed their mission without losing a single man, and that was the mark of a well-prepared team. The young recruits were exhausted, but they were proud. They had done it. And they had done it because of the foundation Mike had helped build, the lessons he had imparted. As they boarded the helicopter for the ride back, Harris turned to Mike. "You did it," he said quietly. Mike looked at him, his expression unreadable. "We did it," he replied. Harris smiled. "You know, you've become more than just a mentor to these men. You've become part of their story." Mike didn't answer right away. He sat back, looking out at the landscape below as the helicopter soared through the sky. He had already made his peace with his past. But now, as the young SEALs settled into their seats, he knew that the future was in good hands. And for the first time in a long time, Mike felt at peace with his place in the world.